Hi there and welcome back. In this video, I want to continue on what we were just talking about in the previous video with Germany and their plan to end the war very, very quick using their overwhelming military might. Understand this. Everyone thought that this war was going to be quick. They expected the new industrial weapons that fueled their militaries to subdue their enemies very, very quickly. And so General Alfred Graf von Schlieffen, you guys can just call him von Schlieffen for the sake of the test, this guy right here planned to end the war quickly by subduing France first and then going after Russia. And I like to use this analogy right here, but we're using these two characters as a point of reference. So we all know Bruce Lee, we all knew Zangief from Street Fighter, and look at how big and strong Zangief is here, just looming over Ryu. How can Ryu ever win? Well, we know that Big Zangief, poor guy, he's strong as an ox, but he's super slow. Well, the Russians were like Zangief. Literally, Zangief is a Russian, right? I guess a Soviet. But the thing is, it's going to take the Russians just an unbelievable amount of time to mobilize because they don't have good transportation networks in the form of railroads. They don't have access to as much materials. I mean, we've already talked about all of these problems that Russia was dealing with that makes them kind of slow to mobilize. And we saw this really during the Crimean War already. But if you look at the guy over here, Bruce Lee is fast. He could rival Ryu's speed and power. And we know that France was able to mobilize very quickly as an industrial nation. They were right there. They're already ready to go. All they had to do was take their people to the border and start fighting. And so it makes sense, according to Schlieffen, that Germany should plant all their power against the French and take them up in a couple of days or maybe a week or so, and then turn their entire army against Zangief, against Russia. And the reason they wanted to do this is simple, guys. They didn't want to have to fight a war on two fronts. So, fast forward to the next page here. Despite the new weapons, no one could get an edge, and Schlieffen's plan completely failed, and a two-front war became imminent. It failed for a couple of reasons. One, because the weapons were not able to subdue the French as fast as they thought, and also because it just so happened that Russia managed to mobilize a little bit quicker than they were thinking it was going to take. And so what you start to see happen is a process of fighting known as trench warfare. Now, this was not anticipated, but this here is a image of what trench warfare looked like. You know, that's a terrible arrow there. And here's another image. I believe this comes from your textbook that shows the different trenches, and people would get up in these trenches. They would get low so they couldn't be shot easily, and they would just launch mortars and shoot each other as people were crazy enough to run across the dead man, I guess the no man's land, or the zone in between the different trenches where if you jumped up, you would die. And this quote right here from the book kind of summarizes it really well. Imagine a broad belt, 10 miles or so in width, stretching from the Channel to the German frontier near Basel, which is positively littered with the bodies of men, and with bodies of men and scarified with their rude graves, in which farms, villages, and cottages are shapeless heaps of blackened masonry, in which fields, roads, and trees are pitted and torn and twisted by shells and disfigured by dead horses, cattle, sheep, and goats, scattered in every attitude of repulsive distortion and dismemberment. So literally, you've got like blown up cows and goats and trees and just a bunch of rubble all over the place that scars this land where the fighting was had because of trench warfare. And also, it prevented anyone on any side from being able to really get gains in this war. So if you look here at this map, before we move on, here was the Western Front, here was the Eastern Front, all right, and really these lines very seldom even moved at all. You can see that the key here shows the furthest Allied advance and the furthest Central Powers advance, and those advances never really they didn't change enough to write home about. Let's put it that way. So this was a very ineffective form of fighting that really produced nothing more than death on a large scale. So On the Western Front, it was mainly fought by French and Germans. The Eastern Front was mainly fought by Russians and Germans mixed with Ottomans. The Russians struggled greatly because of their lack of industries and lack of railroads. They didn't have good communication. They were cut off from their allies, and they couldn't get enough materials, and so they had a bunch of undersupplied troops that they just kept sending to their death. Now, they've got tons of casualties, but they also have tons of troops. So Russia by far had the largest standing army, and that really is basically the only thing that kept them in the war. The Gallipoli campaign that you see here was a campaign that was supposed to establish a route through Anatolia that would enable allies to reach the Black Sea and then reach Russia in order to supply them with any kind of good. You know, you didn't want to go this way. They didn't want to establish this line to get to Russia because this would put them going through Germany's territory, and they thought that the lesser of the two evils would be the Ottoman Empire. So the idea was to supply the Russians like this, all right? But unfortunately, the fighting was too great, and the Gallipoli campaign was a failure. And so they were not able to get these materials, these supplies to the Russians in time, and ultimately this is going to end with Tsar Nicholas II being ousted in power, and the Russian Revolution is actually going to begin, which is going to get Russia officially removed from the war. Now, Germany will be able to focus the full brunt of their power against the West. Now, it's really impossible to understand the extent of this global war and its global nature without talking about total war, which is when a country devotes all resources into winning the war effort. And so what you start to see here, more so than ever before, is the home front where this war is taking place. And so people at home would actually participate in trying to win the war effort as well. And they did this through sending economic resources and rationing their goods. Right, countries were told factories what to produce and how much of it to produce, and they produced war weapons and things like this, whereas they used to produce other kinds of manufactures. Many factories converted to, I just mentioned this, producing war, and also there's going to be rationing of food, rationing of any kind of materials that could be used for promoting the war in Europe. If you're in the United States, and on the home on the fronts if you're in Europe. And so they started to, in the U.S., we had Liberty Gardens, for example. Everyone would just plant a backyard garden so that they could eat vegetables from their own garden rather than going and buying vegetables that could be sent overseas to feed our troops. There was also this use of propaganda, which is one-sided persuasive advertising, and it is always biased, no matter who is using it. It makes, if let's say that the Germans were using propaganda to persuade their people to join the war effort against the Allies. Well, if that happened, then it's always going to make the Germans look good, and it's always going to demonize the people that they're facing off against. And you'll see this when you take a look at propaganda from the period. Propaganda is not new, but the way it's being used, I would say, is more heavily used than really any time before. Women also, as part of this total war effort, women would replace men in factories as the men went to war. And this here was kind of a big deal because really it inadvertently led to women gaining more rights and a better place in society, in particular in America, but really anywhere. This is also going to be kind of what leads women to be able to vote by the end of the war.